Welcome to First Congregational Church in Guilford, Connecticut, where we say whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. This Sunday, we celebrate Dr. King Sunday at church. We're reminded of his faith, his vision, his desire for peaceful life and nonviolence, and we allow his vision to guide us. We hope that all of us will have time on Monday to celebrate the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to go forward doing acts of goodness and peace and justice. Our scripture for today is from the book of James, and it reminds us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. May we practice that even as we roll our shoulders back, we open our hands, our hearts, and our minds. We release the ways that we've misspoken and misstepped and missed the mark of love this week. And we continue now knowing that God's grace holds us, that the Spirit surrounds us, and that there is an abundance of unconditional love that comes to each and every one of us. Let us continue now in our time of worship.
Let us imagine together a January day nearly 70 years ago, January 27th, 1956, just after midnight. A 27-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., a man, activist, pastor, father, and husband, puts on a pot of coffee in his kitchen. His wife and his newborn daughter are asleep, and he himself is bone tired. But he has just received one of the 40 daily death threats to his phone. This one threatened to bomb his house if he continued his work in civil rights for Black and brown communities. This threat, to quote James Cone, stuns him. He cannot sleep. He puts the coffee mug on his table, but he doesn't drink from it. I picture King's hands must have been shaking, or maybe even sweating. His heart must have been beating so fast. He may have needed to take some deep breaths. King said later of this moment that, quote, "Rationality left me, and I began to think about many things." He wanted to call his dad, to reach out to his parent, to someone that loved him, but he felt that he couldn't, that his dad lived too far away for him to call. Then he suddenly realized what to do. With his mug of coffee still on the table, he bows his head over the coffee. I imagine he must have felt the warmth of the vapor from the coffee on his forehead as he said the following prayer, quote, "Lord, I'm down here because I am trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage, and I can't let people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing my courage, they will begin to feel weak." It was in this moment, King said later, that he felt that he had come to know God personally. Cone writes about how in this moment, a burden lifted from King's shoulders and that he felt the liberating presence of God. King writes, quote, "Almost out of nowhere, I heard a voice. This voice said, 'Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you, even until the end of the world.'" It was after this vision in the kitchen, as King called it, that he felt he could face anything. I wonder if he slept that night after this happened. I wonder if he ever did drink that cup of coffee, that cup that radiated warmth on his face as he heard words of God. This story does not end peacefully. 3 days later, white supremacists bombed the King's house. Cone describes how his best friend, James Abernathy, broke the news to him. Cone writes, "To everyone's amazement, King was not visibly shaken." King wrote later that he was unshaken because, quote, "My experience with God has given me new strength and trust. I knew now that God is able to give us the interior resources to face the storms and problems of life. When an angry crowd later came to his house in order to retaliate against the bombing, King said to them, quote, "We cannot solve this problem with retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with nonviolence. We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us. Remember, if I am stopped, this movement will not stop, because God is with the movement." King's faith, sustained by the vision in the kitchen, was the crux of his ministry. His faith fueled the work he did for the rest of his life. James Cone writes about how the voice of God came to him, the three-part message from the voice that was the basis of King's faith with deep roots in the Black church tradition. The quote, "Stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice." This part, Cone writes, represents God's justice, saying, quote, "One cannot be a Christian, according to the Black church tradition, without making the establishment of justice for the poor the heart of the gospel." The next sentence of God's message to King, "Stand up for truth." Cone writes that this truth for King is love, God's love, and the capacity humans have to love one another. Cone writes how God's justice and love go hand in hand, saying, quote, "As God's justice is grounded in God's creative and redeeming love, so human justice is grounded in love." The truth of love kept King going. In the lies of systemic racism and violence, he remained grounded in the truth of love, the love that permeated his actions and faith. Finally, Cone writes about that last sentence of God's revelation to King, quote, "And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world." This sentence, for Cone, affirms the Black church tradition's belief of God's divine presence in the work of social justice. God's presence in the work begets hope that even when faced with hatred, God is on the side of justice for the oppressed. The hard work of liberation is worth doing because God lives within the work of liberation. Hope springs eternal because God is with the movement. We cannot overlook the context of the story of the vision in the kitchen. This vision from God did not come to King without conflict or suffering. This vision came in the aftermath of a deadly threat to King and his family, to his house and livelihood. A man's house was bombed. An angry crowd came to the house desiring to avenge this racist act. God came to King not in a time of peace, but a time of tension. This tension and violence were not isolated, but had been felt throughout the country against Black and brown communities for centuries. And from such tension came the movement for liberation, the movement of love, justice, and hope that started before King and continues today. Speaking for truth, righteousness, and justice comes with tension that King and his fellow Black movement leaders knew well. It is tension that causes controversy and fear, even among the most well-meaning of people. In the years before he was assassinated, King began to speak out against the Vietnam War. He critiqued the complicity of each of us in the prevalent sin of poverty and advocated for universal basic income for all, an idea that remains controversial. He received a ton of backlash for this work in his later years. Meanwhile, over the course of the civil rights movement and beyond, several white religious leaders tried to avoid any tension at all by remaining silent on the topics of racial discrimination and poverty. In his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, King discusses his disappointment in white silence, saying that so many white pastors, quote, have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the security of stained glass windows. I confess that I have felt more cautious than courageous when speaking about the sin of racism. When I was given the task to write a sermon on Martin Luther King, my initial emotion was fear. I was afraid that as a white person, I would be co-opting or appropriating Martin Luther King's legacy by preaching about it. I was afraid of causing inadvertent harm in my sermon because I benefit from institutional racism in ways both visible and invisible. Self-doubt clouded me as I thought to myself, why would anyone want to hear from me about this topic? I think of that staircase that King talks about in the quote that we are talking about today, taking the first step in faith, even if you don't know what the staircase looks like. I've often been so afraid of consequence of not seeing the whole staircase that I do not take the first step in speaking up in solidarity with communities on the margins. The truth is that silence, even silence with the intention of not wanting to cause harm, is still silence in the face of oppression. This silence is one that white people like myself have felt comfortable falling back into time and time again. This is the silence that King critiques. I speak to my fellow white Christians when I say, we cannot let this fear overtake our voice and solidarity with our Black and brown siblings. God is with the movement, and so too must we be with the movement. The stakes have always been too high for us to be silent. We must respond, as King said, to the, quote, fierce urgency of now. He wrote these words in the year 1967, and 57 years on, this fierce urgency digs into our being like claws. Tomorrow's date not only marks the day we honor and celebrate the legacy of Martin Luther King, it marks the ushering in of a government whose platform strives to continue to strip basic human rights from the United States' most vulnerable and marginalized populations. Simply put, these communities are under attack. As people of faith, we must respond, no matter the nervousness present in our bones or the stutter in our words. As people of faith, we must stand courageously in solidarity with Black and brown communities and all those who face oppression as we ascend a steep and tense staircase. We must take part in transformative love as we follow God's path and denounce the sin of racism in word and in action. Beloved community, how do we act in solidarity with our marginalized neighbors? I turn to the words we read from James today. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. When confronted with tension, with the realities of racial injustice and how white people like myself have benefited from it, we must listen to our Black and brown neighbors. We must listen well. And we cannot stay in this listening step. After listening, we must speak. Though we may speak slowly as we unlearn the ways of whiteness, we have to speak up and act when we witness racism in our lives and within our societal structures. And in our listening and our speaking, we must refrain from defensiveness, from anger that may come from unlearning the ways that white people benefit from racism. I see this quote from James as a cycle for the lifelong commitment to anti-racism. It is not a linear process, but is one that we must repeat again and again throughout our lifetime. This cycle is not comfortable, but God is with us in these cycles, in this tension, and in this movement. It is the work of our church to commit ourselves to this cycle. We are not alone in this journey. It is one we take together. It is important to remember that King was not alone in his work. Not only did he have God on his side, he also had incredible people around him, including lesser-known Black leaders like Bayard Rustin, Claudette Colvin, and countless others doing the work of liberation alongside him. This ability to work together is a manifestation of love, this love that comes from God. Beloved church, we must commit ourselves to take up the work of anti-racism. We must stick to it even in the murkiness and fear of tomorrow. May we remember that in times of unease and discomfort, that our listening, our voices, and our actions matter in the fight for liberation. May white Christians like myself have the courage not to stay behind the security of the stained glass windows that white Christians have been doing for centuries. May we too heed the call that King heard all those decades ago, that we might stand up for righteousness, justice, and truth, that we follow God in faith, love, and hope. God is in the movement. God is in the tension. May we not shy away as people of faith. Amen.
In the 19th century, during the struggle for emancipation, there was a spiritual written, "No more auction block for me, no more, no more, no more auction block for me, many thousand gone." During the struggle for civil rights, the gospel lyric from Charles Tinley's "I'll Overcome Someday" got paired with the melody from "No More Auction Block" and got rewritten into "We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. This week, as we remember the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King and celebrate the legacy of his prophetic ministry, we recall that King, in his 1964 book, "Why We Can't Wait," he explained that civil rights activists sing the freedom songs today for the same reason the slaves sang them, because we too are in bondage, and the songs add hope to our determination that we shall overcome. Black and white together, we shall overcome someday. This song has been used so many ways over the years, and verses were added by Pete Seeger and others. We'll walk hand in hand, we shall live in peace, we are not afraid. Union organizers would add, we will win our rights. And other verses were made up on the spot by different leaders at different protests. We shall end Jim Crow, truth will set us free. So at this point in worship, at this point in the life of our nation, what lyrics would you sing? What lyrics would you add? I'll be playing this song probably about 3 times, and so you can make that choice and sing along.